Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Climate of Sport podcast with me, Claire Poole. It's a pleasure to have survived the heat in London to be with you for another week. How many of you saw the extreme heat Climate Week event postponed due to extreme heat post? I said in our newsletter this week that if it was a drinking game, we'd all still be hammered. Of course, we have reached peak irony of Climate Week events about extreme heat being postponed because of the extreme heat. And that's what people are chatting about a lot. It feels like we never stop talking about heat at the moment around the World Cup, the postponement of events, and the impact on our daily lives as well. But we are bringing you more than just heat in this week's pod. There's a few different things to talk about today. It was London Climate Action Week, so we're going to do a little recap of that. We've got World Cup news. Of course, the FIFA Men's World Cup continues. Serena Williams is back at Wimbledon. And so we are rolling back the years. Incredible to see such an icon back on centre court in SW19. So loads going on in the world of sport. But first, if you'll indulge me, some personal news. I'm delighted to share that I've been awarded a coveted Churchill Fellowship. If you haven't heard of it, the Churchill Fellowship funds individuals to spend 4 to 8 weeks meeting global experts in a chosen field, in person or online, to build international networks and exchange knowledge. And then fellows turn those insights into action to help transform communities, shape services, and influence policies across the UK. So, of course, you can imagine when I applied to be a Churchill Fellowship, it was, of course, for our sector of sport, and in this case, nature specifically. So having been awarded one of the Churchill Fellowships, only 109 have been awarded this year out of thousands of applications. So I feel very privileged and fortunate to be in a small cohort of incredible people who have been awarded a fellowship this year. The next year, I'm going to travel to Scandinavia, Denmark and Sweden, and the US to research urban green spaces, as well as urban sport and recreation community spaces that bring people together, because I see these pockets of our inner cities that are left in some cases to dilapidation. And I think there's such a massive potential to use those spaces as areas to not just increase green space, but also encourage movement and recreation. Often we see in cities pocket parks, which are incredible, or we see things like urban gyms or different areas in our parks, but we don't really see both of these things together. And I think it's a massive opportunity to bring together these green spaces and these recreational community spaces together to try and tackle some of what was called in the national emergency briefing cascading crises, which is quite terrifying. But we are currently experiencing these crises across lots of different areas. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis. We're also going through epidemics of loneliness, increased loneliness in our communities, mental health and physical health challenges as well. So in my application to the Churchill Fellowship, I said I wanted to explore the idea of retrofitting these spaces that otherwise would be left disused and unattended, to try and shift them into green spaces to support removing the urban heat island effect, but also importantly, add elements of movement and recreation and sport to them as well, perhaps areas to grow food, to bring communities of young people, elderly people, and everyone in between into supporting and pride in their local communities, as well as supporting these challenges. So it's a massive opportunity. A lot of our work focuses on professional sport, obviously, which is incredible, and that's where we are driving a lot of momentum. But grassroots community sport is obviously the cornerstone of a lot of action as well. And it's a privilege to be able to spend the time and look more into that and take learnings from urban green space leaders in Scandinavia, but also the community sport movement and momentum around major cities in the US, like New York, like Detroit, like Chicago, Philadelphia, where we see these community spaces which are really driven around sport as well and recreation. So I'm really excited to learn. I'll be in touch with many people around these projects to meet project partners. And if you have recommendations of who I should meet next year, please do get in touch. Super excited about that. Okay, on to our climate hat trick for this week. So first of all, we'll start with the London Climate Action Week roundup for those who weren't in the city to join some of the sporting events that took place. There were a lot of events that intersected with sport this year, which is great to see. It gives us a barometer of the fact that sport is becoming a larger part of the conversation around climate action, which is what we want to see. A few different macro themes that I took away. We speak about it a lot, but language does really matter. So, in a number of sessions that I was part of, it came up about language in different ways, to be honest. When we were Sport Positive collaborated with the Oxford University Climate Leadership Research Centre project on an event around high profile individuals driving climate action and how we can leverage that influence. And Zoe McAlpine, who was on that session from Climate Outreach, spoke about what language will work with your audience. And we talk about this a lot in sport. There's the way we talk maybe around sport and sustainability, and then how sports fans or sponsors or suppliers or stakeholders are going to receive that information in the language they're used to hearing and how it translates. So a reminder of thinking what language is going to speak to your audience and what's going to work with your audience came through in one of that sessions. Sometimes it's the stuff we need to think about like that, and sometimes it's stuff we say without even thinking. So on the way home from one of the baking sessions, I got a lovely email. I won't give their name, but they contacted me. They attended the Earthfest session that I was a part of. I spoke at the Earthfest session alongside Rue Dunn from the FA and Kate Chapman from London Marathon. It was chaired by Laura Pierce as well. And someone basically emailed me to say, thank you for using female positive language while I was speaking in that session, saying it was refreshing to hear me speak as if it was the norm. So I didn't even know what I'd said, to be honest. I responded and I was like, this is incredible. I don't know what I said. And they responded that it was me calling it the FIFA Men's World Cup as opposed to just the World Cup. And that's language that we talk about a lot, because in a lot of sports, you have the Euros and the Women's Euros, or the World Cup and the Women's World Cup. And actually, of course, that is then saying one is the standard and the others is the female equivalent, whereas really we should be talking about men's Euro, women's Euro, men's World Cup, women's World Cup, etc. And the same, the Rugby World Cup have already changed their branding to have men's and women's equally in the front of it as well. So that language can be picked up on even when you least realize it. Then some other things that popped up around conversation, the fact that we talk about climate change, which sounds quite a benign phrase, and we should really be talking about the climate crisis, because climate change is a scientific term. It describes the long-term shifts in the Earth's weather patterns and temperature, whereas climate crisis emphasizes catastrophic consequences. It demands urgency, and it sort of infers the human element of those changes as well. So if we are trying to share that things are urgent, that we're in an emergency, then we should be saying a crisis, not just a change. So something to think about there. And in a similar phrase, we spoke a lot about the heat wave. We're talking a lot about another heat wave on the way. We're in a heat wave, etc. David Shuckman, who I interviewed and spoke to during one of the events last week at London Climate Action Week, also mentioned, should we now be calling it a heat storm instead of a heat wave? Because he was saying, after all, we have rainstorms, snowstorms, extreme storms, etc. The idea of a storm gives the inference of disruption being paralyzed on a similar scale to what we are experiencing in heat. So again, heat wave sounding a little bit more gentle and heat storm a little bit more critical. So it's not to get bogged down in language and feeling as though, oh, am I saying something wrong again? It's more just to be thoughtful about what you're saying and whether the way you communicate demands the urgency that we are now seeing. And so lots and lots of conversations around language. The second one is a simple thing, but just a reminder that people sit at the heart of everything. It's such an obvious thing to say, but when I was aware of it, I realized no matter what conversation I was in, no matter who I was interviewing, who I was being interviewed by, or what session I was sitting in, it always comes back to us. It always comes back to human beings. Who are our allies was a question in one of the sessions. As a reminder that Zoe mentioned, what language will work with our audience. It's language, audience, what we're saying as human beings and what's landing with other human beings. How we can use the power of sport to drive excitement for people. That came up in terms of what sport brings to the table to influence public opinion and drive systems change when we in the sport sector collaborate with industry, investors or government, which is what Katie White, our climate minister here in the UK, Katie White, OBE MP, mentioned in our fireside chat, which was very ironic that it was called a fireside chat when we were literally melting in the discussion. So that idea, again, are you centering people within your conversations, or are you talking about data or themes or information that distances perhaps the human implications and the people at the heart of everything we do? It might be something that's happening without you noticing it, but as a reminder, if you can center people and human beings in the way you think and what you talk about and what you do, the likelihood of driving change, connecting with people, driving momentum, fostering pride, and then emphasizing things like education and training are going to come through much more easily, regardless of the topic, if you think about it in that way. So a good reminder. On that note, keeping things simple came through a lot. So again, in the influencing discussion, there was a lot of conversations around how we're telling stories, how we're driving influence. And one of the key themes that came through there is finding a way to talk about our work in a way that everybody understands. As a reminder, no matter how clever you are, no matter how much of an expert you are, no matter how much amazing knowledge is stuck in your brain, if you cannot communicate it in a way that everyone understands easily, you are losing the potential of your impact. So it could be through the lens of sport, which is what we do. It might also be talking about the impact in sport or health or security or something else. But the idea is take complex learnings and make them simple to translate. And Frederick Bertrand, who I interviewed and spoke with on a session at the Formula E Change Accelerated live event, said this in a really nice way about complex approach of making things simple. So he was actually talking about the race to road technology, everything that goes on behind the scenes in terms of motorsport and the engineering and the technology and the very complex side, and then how that translates into efficiencies and making things easy and efficient and ensuring that as car users, it's very intuitive and how that goes from racetrack to road. But I took that in terms of the wider context as well as the way we should be thinking. How do we, in terms of the industry side, make things that are very complex, use that complex approach to make things simple for others? So that's our job as climate communicators. However complex the backdrop, however complex the learnings and the insights, make it simple, make it land, and make it accessible to people. Then finally, two A's that stood out: adaptation and action. So adaptation was front of mind, given the fact we were going to all of these events during London Climate Action Week in extreme heat. So it came up in a lot of conversations about how we're already actually massively changing our usual behaviors day to day because of the heat. But maybe we're just thinking that as, changes we have to make rather than climate adaptation. So a reminder of thinking about and reframing any changes that you make through the lens of climate adaptation. So in extreme heat that we're experiencing, you might be out earlier or later to get in your run or your walk to beat the heat of the midday sun. You might be walking your dog at unusual times of the day to protect their paws against the asphalt as it warms during the hottest part of the day. Maybe you put on little doggy shoes as well. All of these are climate adaptation. Keeping your windows and blinds shut all day, not something you usually do. That's a climate adaptation. Is your shopping order changed? Are you adding more salads? Are you adding more ice creams and gelatos and ice pops to keep, your kids or yourselves happy and cool, ordering more drinks, etc.? That change as well is a climate adaptation to the heat. Are you noticing an increase in your electricity bill because of, if you're very lucky, you have air conditioning on, or more likely that you have fans going in the house and that's bringing you additional costs as well? All of these are climate adaptations, even if we're not thinking about it yet. Adapt to Win ambassadors were at a lot of events, so that brought adaptation to the fore more as well. And we're going to have Pop Spencer Bonzu and Danielle Akagila on the podcast in a couple of weeks. We did a great recording with them. It's going to be out in a couple of weeks to talk more about their insights. So adaptation moving much further forward now, but as a reminder, we cannot stop mitigation and development as well. And all of those three things go hand in hand. We cannot just think this is baked in now and we need to adapt. We have to urgently continue the mitigation efforts as well to try and avoid the least amount of warming that we can. As Antonio Guterres would say, every degree matters at this stage in terms of how we're going to need to adapt in the future. And lastly, the action. I remember being at an event, probably at actually New York Climate Week, maybe 10 years ago, and I was in back-to-back sessions, and it just seemed to be constant announcements and commitments, which was incredible at the time because that was new in terms of hearing sport organizations and brands and businesses make commitments around climate action. And it was a reminder to me in the conversations I was in last week that as difficult as the work is, as challenging as it can be, action is happening. I was asked at the Earthfest event by Laura Pierce what I think is working. We've heard from Rue and Kate around stuff that they're doing that's working and cutting through. And Laura said to me, as someone who works globally, who speaks to a lot of organizations, what is working? And rather than pull out a specific example, I said, I think what we can see is working is the normalization of us talking about it. So conversations that once felt very niche and now much more mainstream. Sustainability is much further embedded into organizations' operations, and expectations have shifted in ways that probably would have been quite hard to imagine a decade ago. It's not happening yet at the speed and scale we need it to in the face of the urgency of the climate crisis. But if you look back to 10 plus years ago, 2014, when I first started working at the nexus of sport and sustainability, it is good to stand back and reflect that enormous amount has changed. And I more and more realize that perspective matters. So progress may be imperfect. We may not be able to go as quickly as we want, and we may not be able to scale and go as fast as we would desire, but the change is real. So use this as your clarion call to keep going, keep the good work going. Story 2 is Air Miles. Infantino strikes again, but worryingly, is he only taking on this massive carbon footprint for the men's competitions? Let's dig into it. So 50,000 kilometers in the first 16 days of the 2026 Men's World Cup is the distance that FIFA boss Gianni Infantino has clocked up on his borrowed private jet, according to reports by the BBC and others. He's trying to get to 2 matches a day, considering the large geographic area of the Men's World Cup across Canada, US, and Mexico. It's a very high carbon emitting strategy, of course. The BBC say it's the equivalent of 78 people traveling for a year. And obviously, this was just the first 16 days of the World Cup. There's a lot more to go. But let's be open to the fact that he is the FIFA boss. This is their jewel in their crown. They are going to this men's competition once every 4 years. So is it right that he be visible at as many matches as possible? You might think that it is, actually. And it's good leadership to show that in as many matches as possible, the top man at the organisation who are putting on this mega sports event is visible at those games, showing that it's important. As a reminder, for the 2022 Men's World Cup in Qatar, he went to some of every single one of the 64 Qatar World matches, although that was in a much smaller geographic area. And of course, half the number of matches took place. What stood out to me as someone who obviously has been following the sustainability efforts around World Cups now for over a decade is that this wasn't the case for the Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. So yes, he also travelled very far and wide at that World Cup, but what sticks in the craw a little bit is that less than 1 week after the Women's World Cup in 2023 started, he did indeed fly in his private jet, but to Tahiti for at least 4 days, meeting with local national associations in Oceania, missing 4 days at least of Women's World Cup matches. So for someone who has made such a point of the carbon emissions, but this being important because he wants to be at as many matches as possible and highlighting how important it is to do so, it's just a real shame from an equity perspective that he doesn't seem to have the same carbon ambitions for the Women's World Cup as well. So it's not quite in line with the sustainability and climate action strategy, especially around sustainable transport efforts of the Men's World Cup that have been publicised. But again, to try and take a more balanced approach, the actual emissions of that are probably quite small in relation to the overall travel emissions for the World Cup when it comes to teams and fans. But again, what we come back to is it is the optics of the travel. And this is what we talk about a lot. The actual carbon footprint and the emissions is one thing, but then it's the optics of how it's viewed as well. The idea there being that whilst the carbon footprint is X number of emissions, the optics of the decisions of how this is happening, again, through a private jet and traveling extensively far and wide, normalizes the fact that this is okay to travel in this way and these massive distances. So not just about the emissions, it's about the optics of that as well. And we'll see how far that story goes. Last story in terms of the climate hat trick is from stadium sponsorship. school lessons in community sports. So we've spoken previously in our weekly newsletter, The Brief. If you're not signed up, make sure you do so. And we've also spoken on the podcast as well about the FIFA Men's World Cup fossil fuel advertising around Aramco, one of their biggest partners. It's everywhere, that you'll see at every single match in every single stadium during the World Cup. It's their top sponsor across FIFA and, of course, the Men's World Cup as well. These advertising boards are everywhere, ostensibly advertising a product that is not really a B2C product. So it's very much about awareness raising and the normalization of fossil fuel sponsorship and fossil fuels existing in our society. So we're not going to get into that right now, because the story actually we're talking about here is that a report came out this week by an organization called Comms Declares in Australia that said they have uncovered 260 fossil fuel funded programs targeting Australian children through community sport, as well as schools and museums. And 6 of those programs account for 54 million Australian dollars in sponsorship. So why are fossil fuel organizations funding community sport, schools and museums? Well, we see this a lot everywhere. And again, it's about the normalization, the socialization of those brands and organizations being a core of our society and infiltrating people, in this case, at a very young age. So what's concerning about this is that it's not big, obvious advertising boards at football stadiums where we're very clear that that is sponsorship. We're talking about educational material for kids. And it says in the report that research suggests that when commercial messages are embedded within trusted content and environments, children may find them even more difficult to recognize and critically evaluate than traditional forms of advertising. So in terms of this sponsorship, it's not just about brand value and awareness. It's about potentially influencing kids through taught materials with, as the report says, quote, selective framing, omissions or industry preferred narratives without the children recognizing them as forms of influence, close quote. The young people who are absorbing these materials are going to live with the impacts of the climate crisis the longest. They are young people right now, and they are going to live with the impacts of the climate crisis for all of their life, basically. So it's more important than ever that young people today understand the causes of climate crisis properly. And it's absolutely critical that they understand where it is. And this report infers that in some areas of the educational material, the focus for young people is on their own emissions in terms of traveling to school, or the way they travel, or the way they think about their own emissions, and not necessarily focused on heavy industry emissions that are causing this. The report does not at all suggest that sports clubs or community organisations are acting properly in accepting the support from these organisations. And it's a really tricky issue because community sports organisations especially are under so much pressure to continue to deliver critical sports in our community that we all rely on, that parents really need in terms of support for their young people. We need young people to get out. We need them to exercise. We need them to be, to do teamwork. There's so many incredible benefits of that. And the, terrifying thing is that the funding is not coming from other areas. So community sports organizations and schools and museums are taking money from heavy carbon sponsors because it's perhaps more difficult to get this revenue and funding from other places. So it's very clear that there is no shade being thrown towards these organizations for accepting that revenue. What this report is saying is, when this happens, what safeguards should exist when coal, oil, gas companies, mining companies, etc., become embedded in institutions that children and young people are taught to trust? So if this happens, should we have guardrails around how that information is disseminated and what can be shared and how? So really important conversations to have. A difficult, uncomfortable conversation for some organizations who are made to make these decisions in order to continue their community programs that are absolutely critical. But important conversations we need to have, because this is the way sport is being used in order to get this messaging out. And at a time where funding is really difficult, it is very challenging for sports, especially community organisations, to keep going in the face of this. So really, really challenging, but important conversations to have. A couple more just bonuses as well, because I don't want you to miss out on this. 2 different reports also dropped in the last week. The Protect Our Winters UK Clean Miles report that basically talks about challenges to people in the outdoor industry or the outdoor sports, whether you're into snowboarding or mountain biking or hill walking, etc., how it's difficult to access those spaces on public transport in the UK, and ideas of how we can overcome that. A really, really good read. So we'll drop the link to that in the show notes. And World Athletics Sustainability Strategy Midway Report, also a great read. They are charting halfway through their sustainability journey around their 2020 to 2030 report, how sustainability has been integrated into all aspects of world athletics operations and plans for the next 5 years as well. So a couple of bonus reports for you to check out. The 3 climate hat trick stories this week are the London Climate Action Week roundup in the heat. Air Miles Infantino strikes again, but is it only for the men? And 3, from stadium sponsorship to school lessons and community sport. So that's our climate hat trick for this week. I hope you are staying cool wherever you are. More heat storms on the horizon in Europe and the US, as well as India and other parts of the world. So do stay cool, stay safe, stay hydrated, and catch us next week on the Climate of Sport podcast with me, Claire Poole.